Hi everyone, my name is Allie, and today I'm going to present on an obesity epidemic in the South Pacific. I think a lot of the time we associate obesity and overweight epidemics with Western countries and just generally countries that are more developed, so places like the United States, Australia, or the UK. We're going to talk a little bit about the extent of overweight and obesity on the island of Nauru, the colonial factors that led to today's epidemic, and some of the current initiatives put in place by the government to reduce the prevalence of obesity. So first, for a little background, Nauru is a tiny, almost circular island in the middle of the South Pacific. The population is only around 10,000, and everyone lives on a ring around the coast, with the center being uninhabitable for reasons I'll explain later. Islands in the South Pacific actually have the highest prevalence of obesity and overweight in the world. Nauru has the second highest after American Samoa, with 90+% of their adult citizens being overweight, and 61% of the citizens are actually classified as being obese. In terms of the under 18 population, about 31% are obese. We've been talking a lot about the obesity epidemic occurring in the US this semester, so for reference, I put up a couple of statistics for comparison, though of course the differing populations of these countries mean that numerically there are a lot more overweight or obese individuals in the United States, but proportional to total population, the prevalence of obesity is much greater in Nauru. Experts at the WHO only expect the prevalence of obesity in Nauru to increase over the next decade or so, and here we can see their projections for obesity rates in Nauru. These are pretty similar to global trends where obesity is expected to continue to climb. It's also important to note that all of these figures are based on BMI, which has been criticized a lot for its use as a universal indicator of obesity or health. Naurans are a naturally stocky people, and a lot of research suggests that they may be more predisposed to carrying extra weight than other groups. So this is good to keep in mind that some of these figures and percentages may be a little skewed. However, based on health statistics, it doesn't seem that the use of BMI creates much of an overstatement of the health crisis. So about 30% of Naurans have a type 2 diabetes diagnosis. Life expectancies on the island are as low as 63 years old, and 44% of Nauruan deaths are attributed to heart disease. So generally a lot of Nauru's burden of disease is from non-communicable diseases associated with high body weight. If you're anything like me, you're thinking these numbers are insane. How did a tiny island like Nauru end up in such a disastrous state? It has a lot to do with Nauru's colonial history, and we'll get into that now. So Nauru is estimated to have been settled by Micronesian and Polynesian peoples about 3,000 years ago. During this time, the island became a stop-off for migrating birds, and the presence of these birds and their excrement created a deep veins of phosphate, which the Nauruan people sat on for years unknowingly. In 1886, Nauru came under German control, and in 1906, colonial settlers realized they had landed on a huge phosphate mine, which they began to exploit immediately. At the beginning of World War I, British-Australian forces took over, and the League of Nations eventually granted a joint mandate over the nation to Australia, the UK, and New Zealand. During World War II, the Japanese seized the island, but by 1947, Nauru was officially under Australian administration again. In 1968, it became its own independent nation and established their own phosphate mining trust, and for a while the country was actually one of the wealthiest in the world based on per capita GDP. But during this time, it also became clear that the phosphate was a finite resource and would eventually run out. The Nauruan government sued Australia over the damages the country had incurred on the land during its administration and settled out of court. In the 1990s, when it became clear that the phosphate was dwindling, Nauru appealed to the International Court of Justice for more damages from New Zealand, Britain, and Australia, and received $12 million each from New Zealand and the UK, and $2.5 million annually for 20 years from Australia. This money was mismanaged by the government, and by the late 90s the country was virtually bankrupt and ended up turning into a money laundering center, which created some revenue for the islanders for a short time, but eventually was shut down by sanctions from major powers. By 2006, the phosphate stores were pretty much tapped out on the island, and 4/5 of the island was completely uninhabitable. So this kind of explains why all the Nauruans live around the coast, because that middle section was destroyed by mining. So that was a lot of history, but it's all super relevant to the obesity epidemic the island is facing now. Because of the destruction from phosphate mining, the land of Nauru is unarable and they can't grow much of the tropical produce which used to naturally occur on the island. So though there are still some coconut and pandan fruits still produced, Virtually all of the food is imported from Australia and it's all heavily processed. Only about 5% of these imported products are vegetables, and these are generally incredibly high in price once they reach the island and are generally unaffordable to the typical Nauruan. So, a normal meal in Nauru is a fried chicken and Coke, but white rice and spam are also incredibly popular. Additionally, the culture in Nauru encourages an unhealthy, sedentary lifestyle. So during its heyday, the government had set up a welfare state that provided free healthcare and education, as well as provided compensation for land destruction that had occurred and unemployment to its people. So this is good in the sense that there are only a small variety of ways to make a living in Nauru, but it's bad in the sense that Nauruans have little incentive to work and haven't for a long time. Estimates for unemployment are pretty shaky, ranging from 23% from some sources to 90% from others, and 95% of those employed are employed by the government. The only other industries Nauru is currently involved in are a little bit of coconut exporting, and they have a large Australian detention center from which they receive income. This has led to a culture that is extremely social but also extremely sedentary. There's little else to do on the island but watch TV and talk, and after so much colonial interference, few traditional and unique pieces of culture remain that might help the people become more active. On top of that, the society values heaviness as a sign of wealth and prosperity, and this comes all the way back from tribal times when only chiefs were overweight and those were the most revered members of society. So that interacts with the high obesity prevalence in its own way. Currently, the government has no plans to develop industry and lacks funds to try and revitalize the wasteland that covers 80% of the island. So, altogether, Nauru is in a really strange and unique position. The citizens are pretty well provided for in education and healthcare, and people aren't hungry, but they're consuming these energy dense, nutrient poor foods because they don't have the income to pay for healthier foods, which are scarce anyways. The government has tried to put in place some initiatives to reduce obesity, like a daily 5K walk around the airport and a 30% tax on imported sugars. But the walk was canceled for undisclosed security reasons, and there's really just no data on how successful these measures were in the first place. They've also put in place school-based initiatives to educate on proper nutrition, but again, this doesn't solve the problem that the country doesn't have the money to import more nutritious foods. Ultimately, Nauru is basically unable to implement any lasting obesity legislation due to its dwindling economy. It seems, therefore, that the country is stuck within this vicious cycle where a sedentary culture precludes it from growing an economy, and a failed economy further stops the nation from taking tangible actions towards lasting change and improving health outcomes. The WHO has put out initiatives, which I read through and were in such a bureaucratic language that I could hardly understand what concrete actions were taking place. But if you want to read about those more, I'll have them linked in the sources. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this video.